Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the importance of ethics in the field of criminal justice. We'll start by defining ethics, then we'll move into an analogy that I like to refer to as the three-legged stool, followed by the history, a look at institutional review boards, what they are, why they're important to us, and then we will move on to wrapping up with how do we protect research subjects, and how do we ensure that we have proper researcher conduct when research is being conducted. The important reading for this particular lecture is Chapter 3 of your course textbook. And I'd also like you to take a look at two videos that are available free via YouTube. One is about the Tuskegee syphilis study, and a second is about the Stanford prison experiment, as well as having some small bits about Stanley Milgram's experiments that all pertain to the field of criminal justice and how we sort of have to constantly question what is ethical and what is not ethical. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we're going to discuss ethics, we need to think about how do we define ethics. And on here, on this particular slide, I have two definitions of the word ethics. One comes from Dave Dooley textbook about research methods dating back to 2001, which defines ethics as the study of right and wrong conduct. And if you look at the definition that's in your course textbook, I believe they take it from Webster's dictionary, something like that, and it's very similar to that one. The one tough thing about these definitions is that they tend to be a little bit stagnant. They don't discuss what I think is an important component of ethics, and that is the dynamic nature of understanding ethics. So what you see at the bottom definition here, where it says from the Greek word ethos, meaning custom, refers to the general beliefs, attitudes, and standards that guide customary behavior. And I think that's an important nuance that we need to think about whenever we think about ethical research. It's the custom, and customs change. They are dynamic. They change from place to place, time period to time period. And as we see with the world that we live in today, things change. What is morally acceptable? What is politically acceptable? Changes from time to time and place to place. And that's one of the things we always have to keep in mind when we look at the study of research ethics. What may have been seen as okay to do to research subjects or to ask them to do in prior times, now as we move forward and we start to understand human behavior even more, we get an idea of like certain things are acceptable and certain things are no longer acceptable. And it's important for us to keep that in mind whenever we're doing any sort of research study. So let's go ahead and move on from there. So an analogy that I came up with several years ago was I find that ethics in all research that involves human subjects is extremely important. We want anybody who participates in a research study to be treated fairly. We don't want them to have harm done to them. We want them to feel that there's some sort of value to the research that they're participating in. But in the field of criminal justice, I believe that it is, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that it's even more important that we make sure that all three legs of this ethical stool are there. And if you think about a three-legged stool, the only way that stool that you would sit on is able to stand is if it has at least those three legs to keep it propped up. So what are those three legs? Well, the first that I think is we want to make sure that all research has some sort of contribution to society. We don't need to waste people's times. We don't need to waste dollars from those who are funding or financing research studies. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing has been thought out and will have some sort of useful outcome for society. The second leg of that stool is we need to make sure we're protecting the rights of the subjects, the humans, who have chosen to participate in that study. And as we'll see in a couple slides, we work in our field with the three most vulnerable populations on a regular basis. And we'll talk about what I mean by vulnerable populations, but protecting the rights of human subjects is extremely important. And finally, the third leg of that stool is that we ensure ethical researcher conduct. So this means we want to make sure that our researchers are doing everything they can to make sure that they are providing useful, valuable information, and they're not tweaking things, they're not lying, they're not fraudulent, they're not plagiarizing, because a lot of our research has major impacts on society. So the first leg of that three-legged stool that I talked about is intellectual and social contributions of the actual research itself. Why is this so important? Well, if you think about the type of research that we do in the field of criminal justice, our research can change laws, can change policies, can inform correctional systems about which programs might work or don't work as far as rehabilitation or punishment or incapacitation. Um, Law enforcement tactics change over time based upon what researchers do in our field, whether it is looking at the influence of body cameras on law enforcement officers. Research informs us about that. Whether it's about mandatory arrest policies if there's a domestic violence situation, our research has informed that. Or finally, another example is we look at different patrol strategies. Do we need our law enforcement officers patrolling in cars, or should they be walking the streets, getting to know the people in the community? All of these different policies, programs, and tactics have been informed and have been changed by criminal justice research. Another reason why it's so important for us to consider the contributions of our research is the realization that we impact not just the cops, not just the criminals, we impact the entire public. We impact the offenders themselves or the accused offenders, guilty or not. We impact all the practitioners who work within the criminal justice system and what their jobs and what they're required to do and how they're required to report. And then also the general public. The safety of the general public is influenced by our research. The second leg of our three-legged stool is that protecting the subject's rights. Now, I mentioned previously that we work with vulnerable populations. Well, what are these vulnerable populations? Whenever you're looking at ethical research, three groups of individuals are deemed to be vulnerable, meaning that in order for them to participate in a research study, we need to take extra steps to make sure that they are participating in a voluntary fashion and they have what is known as a very important term, informed consent. We'll hear the term informed consent in a few more slides later, but it's one of the backbones to doing ethical research, making sure that everybody who participates in your study is doing it of free will and in a voluntary fashion. Well, three of the populations that we work with on a regular basis, there's questions about can they really provide voluntary consent or informed consent? And if you see the list here, we have incarcerated offenders, juveniles, and the mentally ill. These are right in our wheelhouse of people we work with on a regular basis in our research. And so you may say, well, what does that have to do with voluntary consent or informed consent? Well, incarcerated offenders. If you're locked up in jail or prison and a researcher comes to you and says, hey, would you be willing to participate in this study or fill out this survey? You may offer your consent in the hopes that you will get better treatment by the correctional officers or the sheriff's deputies or the warden. And we want to make sure that these individuals understand that they need to be participating in a voluntary fashion with no expectation of benefits or punishment if they say no. Juveniles. When we think about psychological and physiological maturation, we know that kids are not, their brains and their psyche are not fully developed. And so it's important whenever you're dealing with population, especially under the age of 18, that you take extra steps to make sure you truly get voluntary consent. And in your reading, and as we'll discuss in a little bit, one of the sort of safeguards we have when working with juveniles is we need to make sure that oftentimes it's not just the juvenile who provides the voluntary informed consent to participate, but also their caregiver or their guardian also needs to provide that same consent. And then finally, the mentally ill. And I think you can get the idea of somebody with a disability may not have the faculties to provide truly voluntary informed consent. And as you can see, these are three of the groups that we work with a lot when we think about criminal justice related research. And that's why it's so important that we are ethical in how we go about conducting our research. And then finally, that third leg of the stool is making sure that we have ethical research conduct. So one of the key things for us, once again, is we don't just ask people surveys about what kind of food do you like to eat or how much do you exercise. In the field of criminal justice, we ask about some really sensitive data. And therefore, anonymity or confidentiality are extremely important in our field. Let's take a look at some of the things that we measure when we're looking at our field. We ask about their criminal history. So sometimes maybe you don't want the world to know about your criminal history. What or your current offending patterns. Are you going out there and committing crimes currently? So you can imagine why confidentiality, in order for us to get accurate and honest information, becomes really important. Things like gang involvement. Sometimes people don't want to have anyone else know that they're part of a gang, or they don't want other people from a rival gang to know about it. There's substance abuse. Think about trying to keep your job or things that you're hiding from family. Recollection of emotionally disturbing experiences. So if we're asking people to talk about sexual abuse or physical abuse that they've sustained in the past, you can imagine these are all very sensitive things that people don't typically want to share with strangers. But as researchers, we want to do our best to make sure we can get information about these sensitive topics in order to better inform the world, to change policies, to help people heal, and to move forward as a society. So, but in our field, we deal with a lot of these very sensitive data, and it's so important for us to think about the notion of confidentiality. And confidentiality, if you're not familiar with that term, in a basic sense means the researcher promising that none of the personal information collected for the purpose of the study will ever be released in any sort of personally identifiable fashion. All right, let's change the page a little bit and let's talk about the history. Now, we could have an entire semester on the history of ethics and criminal justice research. I'm going to highlight a few of what I think are some important events and things that you should be familiar with, and then I'll also refer you to the reading from our course textbook as well as the 2 videos that I suggest you watch on YouTube. So where did sort of the important sort of starting point in modern sense of when we started to sort of codify or define the requirements of what is quote unquote ethical when it came to research involving human subjects? A good starting point would be the Nuremberg Code. If you're not familiar with the Nuremberg Code, this stems from the end of World War II, where it was realized that things that were going on in the Nazi-based concentration camps and the atrocities that were being done to humans were not just deplorable, but also there were certain scientists and doctors at those concentration camps who thought that they were doing some sort of beneficial research on human subjects. And yet, in hindsight, we look at it and go, no, you were just torturing and harming people in a just horrible fashion. I don't want to go into details right now. So, at the end of World War II, there were the Nuremberg trials, where quite a few high-ranking Nazi officials, military officials, doctors were all brought to trial. And we started to see, the world got a glimpse of exactly what was going on in these concentration camps. And one of the things that came out of it was, on a global sense, this Nuremberg Code was written up as sort of an international or global sort of agreement about how research should be conducted when you're actually dealing with human beings. And the four major things that I want to highlight from it are those listed here under the Nuremberg Code. One is that research should be done with the idea of hoping to achieve fruitful results. That means you don't just do research, just be curious about how something will impact a human. Will this gas harm them? Will it not harm them? Rather, you want to make sure that before you start any research, there is a goal to have useful, informative, fruitful results. A second component that has stood the test of time is the concept of voluntary consent. No prisoner should be forced to do research. No captive should be forced to do research. No free human being should be forced to be involved in research. Any research participant should be able to provide informed voluntary consent. And you've heard me discuss that before, previously too. Also, there should be no unnecessary physical or mental harm. Now, this is one of the things that is really, when I talked about defining ethics in a sort of dynamic fashion where things change over time, we can understand pretty clearly what is physical harm. And when you're doing research, sometimes there's a potential of some types of harm. And that's why it's important for all the research participants to provide that voluntary consent before they start. But one of the things that we've seen over the decades is the notion of mental harm. Is it right or correct to deceive somebody, to make them think that maybe they're sick, or make them think that something is about to happen to them when in fact they're perfectly safe? Well, we know when we look at psychologists and the research, we do realize that even mental harm can have significant long-term effects on individuals. So one of the important things we have to think about is, how do we minimize or limit unnecessary physical or mental harm? And then finally is a notion of freedom to stop participation. Just because I signed up for a study doesn't mean that I have to see it all the way through. I may have thought it was a good idea when I said, oh, I will agree to participate, but in order to be ethical, one thing that researchers need to make sure that they do is allow the subjects to stop at any point in time. And this is even if the subject said, oh, okay, if you participate in this study, we will offer you a gift card, or some other sort of financial incentive. Doesn't matter. If that subject starts the study and realizes that they are no longer comfortable, then they should have the freedom to stop at any point in time. So the Nuremberg Code, coming out of World War II, really sort of laid the initial groundwork of how we needed to rethink any research that involved human beings. In the years and decades that followed, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth, one of the things that we saw was sort of the personalization or personalization of many of these guidelines for different fields of study. So what we have in our field of criminology and criminal justice are professional associations. And this also goes into psychology, sociology, the medical field, where these associations have a personalized set of guidelines about what they deem to be ethical research for their particular area of study. So you see there that I've got a couple acronyms: ASC, WSC, ASA, APA. What these are various professional associations. So ASC is one of the biggest criminology associations in the world. It's the American Society of Criminology. The WSC is the Western Society of Criminology, is another association. The ASA, the American Sociological Association, the APA, the American Psychological Association. So what is important about these associations? Well, as a researcher or as a professor, in order to get your work published and read and disseminated to the larger world, you need to find a place to publish it. And oftentimes you also need a place to present your research at conferences and things of that nature. So these professional associations, they are the organizations that organize and hold these annual conferences for various types of industries and fields. And oftentimes they're also the ones who are the publishers and editors of our quote unquote peer-reviewed research journals. So if I want to publish in one of the journals that is handled by the American Society of Criminology, I have to abide by all of their ethical guidelines. And this is what is allowed to sort of give a little bit of teeth to the idea of making sure that researchers are in fact ethical in how they go about doing their work. And then from there, we also have another example from the historical profession that I think is important for us to consider is the story of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so one of the videos that I have for you to watch on YouTube is a short video that details it. If you're unfamiliar with it, it is not a happy story, but it shows how even when researchers thought they were doing the proper thing and thought they were trying to help people, then for whatever reason, we still see unethical research, even when the cure for the problem comes about. So you can see sort of the basic details starting in Macon County, Alabama, in the late 20s, early 30s. The study was about syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, and prior to having penicillin available, people would suffer from it, and it could lead to all sorts of bad things: blindness, sores, and eventually death in certain people. And this study wanted to see what the overall impact of syphilis was on individuals. And unfortunately, as when you watch the video, you'll see this, that even after penicillin became available, they continued the study. Why? I really don't know. But despite the atrocities that occurred for many of these men and their families that participated in the study for many decades, the good news is there were some good things that came out of it from an ethical point of view. What these were was one of the big parts, and make sure you read about this in your textbook, was the Belmont Report, which came out and sort of dictated in America what the ethical guidelines were for human subjects research. And then within that, we see that finally we've started to make some strides towards ensuring that all research that is conducted is not putting people at unnecessary harm. So take a look at that video, get an idea of what it's about. And sadly, for many of these African-American individuals and their families, it was decades upon decades of pain and suffering when they could have been helped and cured. And it wasn't until, I think, it wasn't until President Clinton's administration in the 1990s that there's finally a formal apology about the atrocities that happened to these individuals. So please take a look at that. And then finally, when we talk about history, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail here in a second about this, are institutional review boards. So at the current time, all universities and other agencies that receive federal funds, in order for you to conduct research that involves humans, and this is as simple as even if I want to put out a survey, like I was joking about before about like, what's your favorite TV show or how much do you exercise? If I'm going to ask people to answer questions, I need to get approval prior to starting my study. Who does that? This body of individuals known as institutional review boards. So what are institutional review boards all about? Well, they're composed, as you can see here, of researchers, colleagues, and members of the community. So at California State University, Long Beach, we have an institutional review board. The size of institutional review boards do change for different agencies and different locations. Typically, we have, I think, roughly around 16 to 18 individuals who sit on a board. And so they're not just professors, but they're also respected individuals from the community. If there's ever an opening, you could actually apply to be a member of our institutional review board. And obviously, a lot of the individuals who sit on it are researchers and professors from various expertise and fields of study. One of the things that's really important for us is whenever you're doing any sort of research in the field of criminal justice that will involve talking to or studying prisoners or offenders, you need to have somebody who was a former prisoner or offender for that research, because it's hard to know if a subject is providing informed consent while they're sitting in jail or prison, unless you ask somebody who's been in that same situation. And so that's kind of the idea of making sure that we have representation across the community and across different fields in order to review various research studies. So where are institutional review boards required? Well, they're required in all institutions that receive any type of federal research funds. So universities, hospitals, RAND corporations, other nonprofits, various state agencies. So Cal State Long Beach has an institutional review board. If you want to do any research with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they have another institutional review board. So to give you an idea, when I did research several years ago with several of our colleagues at Cal State Long Beach, we had to get IRB, which is what the acronym for institutional review boards. We had to get IRB approval from both Long Beach's IRB board as well as the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation IRB board. And so what do? Well, they take a look at your research, and you write up a proposal, fill out an application, tell them exactly what you plan to do in your research, whether here is my survey and here's why I want to do this survey and here's a copy of it, or whether it's an experimental study and you have to describe the experimental conditions. You have to give them a detailed overview of whatever your study will include, where you're going, how many people, how are you going to ask them to participate? Are you going to compensate them with any money or any other benefits? Have you informed them of any risks to participation? So you have to give a very detailed look at what your study is going to be all about. And this is a very important point, you'll notice I say that all research involving human subjects must be approved prior to the start of the study. So if I have an idea, I can't just go out and say, like, well, let's put together a survey, or let's just do a pilot study for this one and then see how it goes before we get IRB approval. No. You have to get IRB approval before you start any of your research. And once again, this is to ensure that you've had multiple professionals and community members and colleagues look over your research and make sure that everything is being done in the most ethical fashion possible. And the IRB board oftentimes will come back after you submit your proposal and say, you know what, we need to tweak this, or do you really need to ask that question, or can you clarify this information? And it may take sometimes weeks, months, or even years before you actually get approval. One of the videos that I am asking you to watch is the one about the Stanford prison experiment. And in that, you'll hear Dr. Zimbardo sort of acknowledge the fact that he started this study thinking, I'm not going to do any harm to people because I'm not actually physically harming them. And as the study progressed, he had a colleague come up to him and going, what are you doing to these poor young men? And he hadn't realized the potential mental harm he could be doing and psychological harm he was doing to these guys until a colleague pointed it out to him. And this is why institutional review boards have become so important. And as frustrating as some people may say they are, and say, oh, I just want to start my research, but I have to get IRB approval. Guess what? It is a necessary thing, because they may see something that you weren't even predicting. All right, so let's move on to the idea of how do we protect human subjects? What are the key components? So for these next few slides, I'm going to go kind of hitting the high points. Your book, I think, does a good job of going into more detail. And once again, this could turn into not a 35-minute presentation, but it could turn into very much longer. So let's try to hit some of the high points with this. All right, so what are some of the key rights of anyone who's involved in research? Number one, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, is informed consent. Voluntary written consent to participate. So one of the things that you have to get approved by an IRB board, that institutional review board, before you start your research is you have to write up a document. It may be a page, it may be 2 pages. And this is called an informed consent document. You present it to any of the people who are considering participating in your study, and they have to read through it. It describes the study. It describes any benefits the subject should expect. It describes any potential harms they might expect. And then it also tells them and reminds them of their freedom of participation, their ability to quit at any time, and then they sign it. There are certain times that you can have not written consent, but you can have oral consent. And the reason for this, to have oral consent, is because as soon as somebody signs their signature or writes their name, you're losing some amount of anonymity. And that's an important concept. Sometimes you want to be as anonymous as possible. So sometimes it's just an oral consent, but once again, these are things you negotiate with that institutional review board in order to make sure you can ensure confidentiality, or in more extreme cases, pure anonymity. And then also you'll notice I say here that there's special circumstances for vulnerable populations. So remember, those vulnerable populations were incarcerated individuals, juveniles, and the mentally ill. So for those individuals, oftentimes you need to not just have their permission or their consent, but also a caretaker's or a guardian's consent in order to make sure you sort of have a backup to really ensure that informed consent. You also, another right of research participants that has to be sort of declared by the researcher themselves is that, are they doing everything they can to protect the subjects from psychological or physical harm? As I've mentioned before, also the idea to stop participation at any time. And then confidentiality. And confidentiality is important to think about the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. So confidentiality, as I defined before, means that I, as a researcher, may have access to the information you provided, but I promise not to share it with anyone and never to reveal your personal responses. So when I write up my statistics and my research results, I either aggregate my results so that nobody can identify who exactly said what or did what, or if I'm taking quotes, like in a qualitative study, from something that a research subject may have said to me, I will not use their real name, right? So that's confidentiality. Anonymity is a little bit more extreme. Anonymity means that as the data was collected, even the researcher cannot connect that information back to the person who said it. So I know for me, when I've worked on studies where we've done survey research, one of the key things we do is we have people sign an informed consent document, and then they drop it into a sealed box. Then they get their survey. They put no names, no identifiers on that survey, and once they've filled it out, they submit it in a separate sealed box. So even though I may have a list of people who signed on to participate in the study, I can never match that person with the particular survey that they filled out. So that's anonymity. So it's a little bit even a further step beyond confidentiality. And then also we have the right of debriefing. So sometimes in order to really study human behavior, you got to fool people a little bit, right? So if I want to see, are you really a good person? Are you a good Samaritan who'd be willing to step in if somebody was in trouble? I may design a study where You go down the road and you think that you're supposed to get to a meeting for some sort of important project, and I tell you, oh my goodness, you're running late. Hurry to that meeting. And as you're going across campus, you see somebody who has fallen down and is injured. And the real purpose of my study is to say, would you actually stop to help them? But I don't want to tell you that, because if I tip you off to the fact that I want to see whether or not you're an altruistic person who's a good Samaritan who would be willing to help somebody, if I tell you that, then you're probably going to behave in that manner. So sometimes we tend to mislead people in research studies in order to really understand human behavior. Well, if that is part of your study, one of the key things that you have to incorporate is this concept of debriefing. And that means that after the study is done, you go back and you explain to the subjects, here's what we were really getting at. And even though we may have given you a false cover story about why you were here or why you were participating, here's what we were getting at, and here's what we hope to learn, and here's why it was important, and things of that nature. And finally, we have the importance of, if you're participating in research, you should expect meaningful research results. And this you saw in previous slides also, the notion that people should not be forced to waste their time just to engage in research. All right, so what are the problems with human subjects? Well, first, we always have to take into account, thinking about the potential problems, think about if you're sitting on an institutional review board and you're reviewing somebody's proposal, this is what they're looking for. What are some of the things that maybe go, no, we shouldn't approve this research study? So the first area is obviously physical or psychological harm. And this one's tough. Physical harm is somewhat easy to ascertain and determine. Psychological harm, though, on the other hand, is something that may bother me, may not bother other people, right? I mean, we've done studies where you're talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and you're describing a situation, whereas for many people, they may go, no, I've never had that happen to me. I've never been assaulted. I've never had somebody threaten me. A spouse or partner has never been, hit me, and it doesn't bother them. But you never know what triggers are there for people who potentially have been a victim. Think about it sort of as a, post-traumatic stress disorder. If somebody's suffering from PTSD, the slightest thing, fireworks on the 4th of July, can sort of bring back certain memories and incite actual psychological harm, which can actually even have physical consequences too. So trying to ascertain the potential psychological harm that even a simple survey question might bring upon somebody is rather difficult. And once again, it's why it's so important to have proper review of studies prior to them going into effect. Another potential problem we have to keep in mind for human subjects is the potential damage to their reputation. If we're asking about, think back to when I mentioned the idea of, we talk about and ask about some really sensitive stuff, drug use, criminal behavior, etc. And you can imagine that if the information was leaked, if it was made available to employers or family members, that could be a lot of damage to their reputation. And that ties into the importance of how do we make sure that the researchers are able to ensure confidentiality. And then finally, when it comes to potential problems, the last major area is the notion of the inconvenience, right? We need, in order to study human behavior, we need people to willingly work with us. Right now, in the era that we're dealing with COVID-19, there are studies and clinical trials out there to try to find a vaccine. And you can imagine it takes a lot of guts for somebody to say, okay, I'm willing to be exposed to this virus for the sake of protecting humanity going forward. And you're hoping that it's not an inconvenience, and it's not going to be, a physical, mental, financial, whatever, or time expense to them. So you always want to find ways to limit that, because human subjects research can be as mundane as some simple questions about what did you eat last night, all the way up to potentially injecting somebody with a live virus, right? So there's a large realm of information that we work with when we deal with humans. All right, so how do we protect our human subjects? Well, you're going to start to see, I'm hoping that you're getting an idea as we go through this lecture. We're starting to see a lot of repetition. So protection comes in the form of informed consent. That may not protect you from the harms, but at least informs you in the first place and make sure you know what you're getting into prior to actually starting the study. Once again, another thing we've talked about, the importance of confidentiality and or anonymity of the records and the information. We have to have ways to maintain that. I know at Long Beach, whenever we do research, we have to talk about having encrypted data files. Anything that is physical data, papers or anything else, we keep under lock and key in a locked cabinet, and it's there for a certain amount of time, and then several years after the end of the study, it has to be disposed of and destroyed. So there's a lot of things of making sure that we have confidentiality and or anonymity of the records. And then obviously throughout the course of the study that it's never revealed that somebody is particularly participating in the study or is a subject. So all the things to maintain their privacy so that if they don't want their family knowing, their family doesn't know. Friends, workers, bosses, things of that nature also fall under that. And key, as I've discussed before, we have to find ways to make sure that there is IRB approval. If you have IRB approval, you've got somebody, and remember the researcher, and this is one of the, I'm going to step back for a second and mention this. One of the key things about the IRB is you have not just extra sets of eyes, but you have people who aren't as invested in the study reviewing it. And think about that, right? If I'm a researcher, I may be really fascinated about studying, the drug use of individuals who go to music festivals. And I want to understand it. What substances are they using? Why did they choose that substance? Why, do they trust their dealer that it's actually what that they actually thought they were purchasing? And I want to get out there and I want to get that information. Well, that means that I'm going to be asking people some really, personal information in order to get that. Well, I am so invested that I may not be able to be as objective about protecting them as I should. And this is why IRB approval, one more reason why it's so important to have multiple extra sets of eyes and brains reviewing your proposal prior to me going out there and starting to ask people about what drugs do you use? Why do you use it? Do you trust your dealer? All these things. So this is one of the things why IRB approval has to be one of the main fundamentals of ethical research. And then finally, we have the notion of selecting the appropriate research design for the topic. And we'll see this in the weeks to come. One of the key things is when you select a research design is if I could get the right information with a simple survey, stick to a survey, right? But certain things may require more intense observation or experimental research, things that tend to be a little bit more intrusive into their lives than a survey. So you have to sometimes figure out what is the appropriate research design to get to what I actually need to get to. All right, and finally, in these last two slides, we're going to talk about how do we ensure proper researcher conduct, right? We want to protect the human subjects, that's number one, but also we have to make sure that our researchers are being ethical. And as I've mentioned previously, in order to maintain a career as a professor or researcher, you have to conduct research. So there are sort of hidden incentives for people to be unethical, and we have to find ways to combat that sort of urge by some people to deviate from what is proper. So the problems that researchers bring is obviously they can harm the subjects. They plagiarize. I mentioned this in a previous lecture that we think of professors as being, rule followers and, people who are ethical. We hope that to be the case, and we hope that they've proven that, but humans are humans, and there's cheaters and plagiarists at all levels of society without going into any more detail. So we have to find ways to combat plagiarism, fraud, outright lying about their findings. We had a case real quickly about, if you Google or if you're familiar with the case of Scott Peterson, who was convicted of murdering his wife, Lacey Peterson, and their soon to be but unborn child quite a few years ago, where a researcher at another Cal State asked the research methods students to go out and interview people in the community about whether or not they would be biased against Mr. Peterson if they were asked to be on the jury. So it was a pretty simple assignment. The students went out and were supposed to make random phone calls or talk to people on the corner and say a series of questions and say, hey, if you were asked to be on this jury, could you be unbiased for this capital case against Scott Peterson? And so sure enough, the students turn in their research, and the professor goes, wow, this is really informative. So much so that it was then shared, that data was shared with the judge who was overseeing the case, and it led to it was one of the key things that led to changing the county where that capital case was heard. Well, lo and behold, not too far after that, several of the students came out and said, oh, I never actually talked to anybody. I just needed to get an A in the class, so I just made up responses. I just basically lied. That's fraud, right? So you can see even that, whether you think of it as a large impact or a small impact, fraud happens, whether it's due to the research helpers, the researcher themselves, the research assistants. Fraud, plagiarism, all that stuff is not as uncommon as people would like to think. And also wasting people's time, right? There's no reason for researchers to be asking more than they need to, taking more time, observing people any more than they need to. So how do we limit some of these things? And then finally for this one is the idea of research is funded, right? There's certain small research projects that I go, okay, I can pay for this out of my own pocket. But other times I'm going, wow, I've got to make phone calls, I've got to print paper, I've got to buy certain software, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've got to travel to different locations. That gets expensive. Well, how do I fund it? I look for somebody to fund it. And so we have the National Institute of Justice funds research. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation funds research. Private organizations fund research. Like tire companies will fund research about appropriate tires. So one of the things we always have to keep in mind when we're looking at research is who paid the bill, right? Because you can imagine if somebody is unethical, they may lean their research findings to support the private interest of the person who funded it. I know with working with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we had to come to an agreement on a research project where we work with them, where they wanted to see what we were going to publish. But we also wanted, for our ethical purposes, to make sure that they wouldn't shut down anything that was sort of damaging to them. So we had to lay out an agreement about, here is the amount of time that we will give you to review any of our reports, but we will publish them. And so there's got to be that balance of the private versus public interest. And then finally, and I know this has been a long presentation, but please bear with me, we're almost done. How do we enforce and sanction researchers? The tough thing is, and I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot of teeth to a lot of these things, but how do you punish a researcher? And the key takeaway, I think, from this slide is this. One of the best ways to punish somebody is to take away their livelihood. And if somebody has worked most of their life to earn a graduate degree or whatever degree they have, and to work in a certain field and become an expert in a particular topic, taking that away from them is a big punishment. And that's what I think is sort of the takeaway from what you'll see here about the various forms of enforcement and sanctioning that are out there when researchers go astray or become unethical. So the first one we have are professional associations. Well, what can professional associations do? And remember, these were those things like the American Society of Criminology, the American Sociological Association, etc. Well, in order for me as a professor to keep my job, as I said before, I need to conduct research. I need to present my research at conferences. I need to publish my research. Well, the professional associations can look at somebody and say, okay, if you have evidence of plagiarism, fraud, or other unethical stuff, we can deny your ability to publish in any of our journals. We can also publicly reprimand you. We can sort of cancel your ability to attend any of our conferences. One of the particular professional associations that I worked closely with in the past, we actually had a list of individuals who were no longer allowed to have any work or be part of the association. So there is a way to sort of take away the lifeline in that sense of people who run afoul of these ethical guidelines. At the government level, if there's like the National Institute of Justice or other sort of like, government agencies that are funding research, they can always withhold funds to the individual or the institution. And I guarantee Cal State Long Beach would not be very happy with me if they found I was doing unethical research. And so they don't, that's why their IRB board will scrutinize my research pretty closely, because they don't want to be seen as connected with an unethical researcher. And then also rarely fines and criminal charges, if somebody has an egregious violation of unethical violation, they can bring criminal charges and fines. Usually though, these are rather rare. And then what can the research subjects do? Well, the research subjects can complain to the IRB, complain to the professional association, file a civil complaint. But probably one of the final things that we see with this one is, in today's day and age, one of the biggest things, and if you think back about it, if you go searching about it, if somebody runs afoul of these ethical guidelines, it's the media. The media will get you. They can expose the story, which then will oftentimes then lead to the government, the professional associations, research subjects coming forward to file civil complaints when researchers are behaving in an unethical manner. So that's a quick wrap up. A little longer than I had planned for this one, but it kind of wraps up a good look into ethics within the field of criminal justice. And we will obviously be sort of sprinkling this and going into more detail in further lectures going forward. So take care.